Let us begin with the fact that Versailles was not merely a document on paper. It was a political wound that ached in the German body for years and provided fertile ground for a cunning plan of revival. The moon over Versailles shone cold and indifferent. In the halls where not so long ago the fates of empires had been decided, on the 28th of June, 1919, Germany signed a document that ordered it to become smaller, in size, in rights, in pride. For many Germans, it was not a treaty, but a humiliation, the dictate of the victorious powers, legally fixing Germany's responsibility for the war, Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, and burdening the country with unimaginable reparations and restrictions. What exactly did Versailles demand? Territories. Germany lost Alsace and Lorraine. Parts of its territory were ceded to Poland, including the corridor to the sea. There were territorial concessions to Belgium and Denmark. The Rhineland was demilitarized and Germany's colonies were handed over. Armed forces. The German Wehrmacht was prescribed a kind of medical remedy, let it be small. The army was limited to 100,000 men. General mobilization, large tank formations, military aviation, and submarines on their previous scale were banned. Artillery and heavy equipment were to be kept to a minimum. Navy. The permitted fleet was strictly limited. A minimal number of battleships, submarines, and naval forces were allowed. Reparations. Germany was obliged to pay huge reparations. The amount and the payment schedules became the subject of bitter public debate. Economic and legal restrictions, control over industry, weakening of the military industry, dismantling of arsenals. To millions of Germans, the treaty looked like an accusation. You unleashed this monstrous slaughter, now pay. To economists and politicians, it was a mechanism intended to keep Europe's militaristic instincts in check. But history knows one weak point of any coercion. If punishment is perceived as dishonor, it breeds revenge, and revenge often disguises itself as revival. How Versailles was conceived and why the calculation failed. Versailles was built on three ideas: to pay for the damage, to deprive Germany of power, and to create a security system in Europe. In theory, everything seemed reasonable, but in practice, people with imperfect maps of the world were making the deals. First, reparations. Enormous payments constrained Germany's economic growth, but at the same time they partly fed the financial institutions of the victors. Money moved in circles. Germany paid reparations, received loans, repaid with other payments, and in the end, dependency was created rather than a durable settlement. Second, military restrictions. By depriving Germany of aviation, tanks, and submarines, the Allies thought they had deprived it of the ability to attack again. But this simple approach failed to take into account one thing: technologies do not die, people do not disappear, industry remains, and if there is will and money, there are always ways to bypass formal prohibitions. Third, the diplomatic fix. Versailles was not signed voluntarily within Germany. The very form of the dictate generated a vertical of resentment and myths, the stab-in-the-back legend, which political demagogues would later exploit successfully. People felt political and economic helplessness and sought someone to blame. On that soil, the ideology of revenge found fertile ground.
The first evasive maneuvers, from the underground to open deception. Already in the 1920s and 1930s, when any talk of new weapons was considered improper, a network of workarounds began to take shape in Germany. International training arrangements. Germany was not completely isolated. In the 1920s and 1930s, diplomatic and commercial activity continued. In particular, Polish-German and Soviet-German agreements made cooperation possible that did not officially look like preparation for the revival of military power. Civilian covers. banned military aviation returned in the form of sports clubs, civil flight schools, and flying circles. Tank warfare was cultivated under the guise of agricultural mechanics and tractor enterprises. What was officially called a tractor could in reality serve as a platform for armored projects. A particularly elegant example of such hidden preparation were the agreements with Soviet Russia in the 1920s and 1930s. Under the Treaty of Versailles, the two sides restored economic and diplomatic relations. Few at the time suspected that Rapallo would give Germany the opportunity to train pilots and develop armored warfare on Soviet territory, far from the eyes of the League of Nations and the Western press. In the 1920s, after hyperinflation, Germany's salvation came through international financial schemes, above all the Dawes Plan, and later the Young Plan. These arrangements restructured reparations and brought foreign capital into Germany, primarily American loans. Banks of the United States of America and European investors poured millions into the German economy, making it possible to restore industrial capacity, infrastructure, and ultimately dual-use production. In the 1930s, after the Nazis came to power, financing became partly internal. The state, under the wing of the Reich and industrialists, Krupp, Thyssen, and Rheinmetall and others, activated a war economy. But above all stood the methods of Germany's finance minister, later Minister of Economics, Hjalmar Schacht. In the years 1933 through 1934, a clever instrument was devised for financing hidden military programs, the MEFO bills. These were promissory notes issued by a fictitious intermediary company, MIFO, used for payment for defense orders and to conceal the government's real expenditures. The simple phrase, "we do not pay directly," only works in peacetime. When crisis comes, pieces of paper turn into real armies.
At the same time, industrial magnates invested heavily in military programs since, for many of them, the rise of the armaments sector was a way to preserve and multiply capital. Large firms shifted to military contracts, using old factories and building new facilities that were officially labeled civilian, agricultural machinery, mining and processing equipment, but in reality provided the technology of a war machine. One must not forget the suppliers of raw materials. A war machine needs oil, iron ore, rubber, and special metals. Sweden, iron ore, especially from Luleå, and the countries of the Balkans, and later Romania, under German influence, the Ploiești oil fields, became the most important supply points. German diplomacy secured access to these resources. Economic agreements and political pressure made deliveries possible, and later, after military successes, nearly unavoidable. The elegant part of the deception was the art of calling things by other names. Versailles forbade Germany to possess combat aviation. What did the Germans do? They created flying clubs, sports aviation, and civilian flight schools, and through them restored a living pilot base. Moreover, air power did not appear overnight. It was born within bureaucratic constraints, first as paramilitary organizations, then as an air administration, and finally as an open state structure when the time came to drop the masks. In 1935, when Great Britain and France were already weary of economic crisis and domestic politics, Germany officially announced the creation of the Luftwaffe, and the world was confronted with a fait accompli. Tanks were the next trick. Open tank production was forbidden, but tractor manufacturing was not. German engineers worked on tractor chassis and wheeled platforms that could easily be adapted for armor. Factories labeled agricultural were in fact designing suspensions, transmissions, and engines suitable both for farm machinery and for armored vehicles. At the same time, in relations with the Soviet Union, training grounds were established where the tactics of mechanized forces and aviation were developed, far from the eyes of the League of Nations and the Western press. Naval deception was even two-faced.
Submarines had been banned under Versailles, but the Nazis focused on developing auxiliary vessels and torpedo technologies, while in diplomacy they secured partial concessions. For example, with Great Britain in 1935, the Anglo-German Naval Agreement recognized a partial legitimization of the German fleet. This was not a failure of a system of checks and balances, it was its wear and exhaustion.
The apex of deception became an open demonstration, remilitarization, and audacity. By the middle of the 1930s, Germany was no longer disguising parts of its power, it was openly challenging Versailles. In 1935, Hitler announced the introduction of universal conscription, and the world, absorbed in its own problems, failed to deliver a decisive response. Great Britain and France were concerned, but they did not want war. Domestic politics and economic interests restrained them from firm opposition. As a result, steps that formally violated Versailles went unpunished. The peak of audacity came with the remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936. Troops entered the demilitarized zone and, meeting only diplomatic protest, continued forward. Germany proved a simple truth to a peace-weary world. If there is no resolve against you, the formality of a treaty quickly loses its force. If one asks who paid for Germany's revival, no single answer is possible. History speaks of a complex network of sources. Foreign capital of the 1920s, American banks through the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan provided inflows of capital, stabilized the Reichsmark, and allowed industry to revive. Without this financial oxygen mask, Germany would hardly have been able to begin modernization. Internal financial tricks of the 1930s, MIFO bills, and hidden state debt made it possible to launch defense orders below the visible budget. The state did not pay immediately, but promised to settle accounts later, and that later became a way to gain speed. Industrial giants, Krupp, Thyssen, IG Farben, and others invested in factories, built logistics, and provided technology. Their capital and productive capacity were no less important than loans from abroad. Conclusion: the main supplier was not a single country, but an entire network. American loans, German industrialists, and the global raw materials market all together gave Germany the opportunity to be reborn in secrecy. It is impossible not to see the tragic beauty of this process. Versailles, created as a means to preserve peace, generated a sense of wounded honor that easily turned into a thirst for revenge. A web of financial and industrial relationships provided the mask of recovery, while the patterns of diplomacy and secret agreements concealed the true objective. When the moment came, Germany boldly tore off the masks. Open remilitarization, Hitler's public speeches, demonstrations of power, and in 1939 the world shuddered. How exactly did Germany deceive everyone? It did not perform a single monstrous magic trick. It used a combination of economic cunning, diplomatic flexibility, technological dual use, and social mobilization. It turned civilian factories into military arsenals under the cover of scientific and technical development, revived aviation under the guise of sport, trained pilots and armored warfare tactics far from prying eyes, and finally secured money and resources through foreign loans, investments, and raw material contracts. Versailles revealed to the world the danger of punishment as the foundation for a future war. When a state feels deprived of a dignified place in the world, it will seek ways to reclaim what was lost, sometimes legally, sometimes deceitfully. What does this history teach us? First, any system of checks and balances works only when there is political will to uphold it. When states are weakened by internal problems, they are not ready to take risks for the sake of enforcing formalities. Second, militarization through economics and finance is a reality. Money, industry, and raw materials matter more than the wording of treaties. Third, diplomacy built on humiliation breeds revenge and makes peace fragile.